In 1895, a woman sat down, closed her eyes, and announced that she could see inside an atom. Not with a microscope, not with any scientific instrument, with her mind. She described hydrogen as 18 interlocking units arranged in a precise geometric pattern. She described sodium as having an upper globe, 12 funnels, a lower mirror image, and a connecting rod. She cataloged all 92 naturally occurring elements this way, one by one, publishing diagrams so detailed they look like technical blueprints from a physics department. And here's the thing that should stop you in your tracks. Some of it was right. Today we're following Annie Besant, atheist, socialist, proto-feminist, Indian independence leader, and the woman who claimed to map the atom using nothing but psychic vision. Before we get to the atoms, let's take a look at who Annie Besant actually was, because the atoms only make sense in the context of a life that made absolutely no sense by conventional standards. Born in London in 1847, she was the wife of an Anglican clergyman. That's where the conventional part ends. She separated from her husband, rejected Christianity, and began a decades-long run as one of the most disruptive figures in Victorian England. She became a prominent atheist, writing attacks on the Church of England and the grip organized religion had on public life. She became a leading speaker for the National Secular Society alongside Charles Bradlaugh, and in 1877, the two of them were actually prosecuted for publishing a book on birth control, at a time when that kind of thing could destroy your reputation entirely. She even lost custody of her daughter over it, but she didn't stop. She became a leading speaker for both the Fabian Society and the Marxist Social Democratic Federation, and her involvement in the London Matchgirls strike of 1888 made her a pivotal figure in early British labor history, helping factory workers, many of them teenage girls, fight back against a company that was literally rotting their jaws with industrial phosphorus exposure. She enrolled at the University of London to study science and was one of the first women admitted, but she was ultimately unable to complete her degree because her professor felt her social views were too radical. This is the woman who later became president of the Indian National Congress, the only British woman ever to hold that position. She founded the Indian Home Rule League and spent the last decades of her life in Adyar, India, working toward the end of British colonial rule. She was, by any measure, one of the most consequential women of the 19th century, a serial reinventor, a person who kept taking the next radical steps no matter the cost, which makes the pivot to theosophy and to psychic atom gazing both completely surprising and somehow totally predictable. In 1889, Annie Besant was asked to review a book for the Pall Mall Gazette. The book was The Secret Doctrine by Helena Blavatsky, the founder of the Theosophical Society. Besant sought an interview with Blavatsky and was converted. This shocked everyone who knew her. Charles Bradlaugh, her longtime collaborator and fellow rationalist, couldn't understand it. The Marxists and Fabian saw it as a betrayal. Here was their leading scientific materialist walking straight into mysticism. But Besant herself didn't see it as a contradiction. Theosophy held that the nature of things runs deeper than empirical science can reach. She once said, "It is the fact that man, being himself divine, can know the divinity whose life he shares." For a woman who had spent 20 years fighting materialist battles, workers' rights, women's bodies, state religion, and found them somehow incomplete, Theosophy offered a framework where matter and spirit were not opposites, where the physical world was a surface and what lay beneath it was knowable if you had the right kind of sight. This is the intellectual context we need to understand occult chemistry. Occult Chemistry is a book Besant co-authored with C.W. Leadbeater, both senior members of the Theosophical Society. Its full subtitle tells you everything. Investigations by clairvoyant magnification into the structure of the atoms of the periodic table and some compounds. It claimed that the structure of chemical elements could be assessed through clairvoyant observation, specifically the third eye. Leadbeater, a former Anglican clergyman, claimed he developed this ability first, but both of them said they had been trained by Eastern masters, Mahatmas, in a yogic practice described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras as the ability to acquire knowledge of the small, the hidden, and the distant. The method as they described it was focus the mind's eye on a chemical sample, psychically disintegrate it layer by layer, and then count the constituent units. Mapping the geometry, they recorded it all. The basic unit they identified they called the Anu, Sanskrit for atom, which they described as a kind of vortex in the ether, a spiraling fundamental particle from which all matter was composed. The Anu count for hydrogen came to 18. Oxygen and nitrogen were far more complex, and as atomic number increased through the periodic table, the geometric complexity of each element's structure grew accordingly. Their colleague, Jinnah Rajadasa, made detailed notes and diagrams throughout. The resulting illustrations, published from 1895 onward in Theosophical journals and compiled into book form in 1908, look uncannily like early 20th century atomic diagrams. nested structures, orbital arrangements, geometric symmetry. They're strange and beautiful and super weird. The elements were grouped not by the periodic table's atomic number system, but by the shapes of their psychic forms. Spikes, dumbbells, tetrahedra, cubes, octahedra, and stars. So boron, nitrogen, and vanadium, atomically unrelated, were grouped together because they all had 6 funnels opening on the 6 faces of a cube. And then, buried in the data, were things that were harder to explain away. Here's where things get even more bizarre. When Besant published her initial investigations in 1895, mainstream science held that atoms had no internal structure whatsoever. That same assumption had been in place since ancient Greece. Rutherford's nuclear model didn't arrive until 1912. Protons weren't confirmed until 1919, and neutrons in 1932. Besant had diagrammatically portrayed structures corresponding to those components in her 1895 article. She and Leadbeater observed variations in the atoms of neon, argon, krypton, xenon, and platinum at a time when scientists didn't yet know that elements could have isotopes. Isotopes weren't theorized until 1912, when Frederick Soddy studied radioactivity. In 1909, they recorded a mystery element they called mesurium. Science detected it in 1937 and named it technetium. They described element 85 in 1932, named astatine by science in 1940. They described element 87, which was named francium in 1939. Some true believers take this as evidence that Besant and Leadbeater genuinely saw subatomic reality. A small number of physicists, mostly working at the edges of the field, have argued that their descriptions of the Anu bear a suspicious resemblance to quarks or to structures predicted by superstring theory. Skeptics have a simpler explanation. Yale's History of Chemistry notes that the occult chemists left behind a bunch of evidence suggesting that, from the beginning, at least some of them had access to conventional scientific sources, and may have been, consciously or not, working backward from known data. For instance, the 18-unit count for hydrogen. You can divide by 18 and you get 1, hydrogen's atomic weight. Oxygen and nitrogen's Anu counts divide similarly to give approximations of their known atomic weights. That's a remarkable coincidence if you're counting with your eyes closed. Leadbeater had a large personal library of ancient histories and scientific texts. The elements described as undiscovered at the time of their clairvoyant investigations were often elements that had been theorized but not confirmed. Gaps in Mendelev's periodic table that chemists were actively hunting. And then there's Besant herself, who was admirably honest about the epistemological limits of what they were doing. In a 1905 lecture, she said plainly, "We have absolutely no proof. We could not prove what we saw about the atoms, we could only say we saw them. The occult researcher must always lie under the imputation of dogmatism. He can only say, 'I do not ask you to receive the results of my sight as though I could prove them.' And he has no right to be offended if anyone says, 'I do not accept your observation.'" That's a surprisingly rigorous epistemic position. She's not claiming proof, she's claiming observation. She explicitly invited skepticism. Here's the question we're left with, because I think is genuinely interesting. What do we do with knowledge claims that can't be verified, but keep bumping into things that turn out to be true? The standard move is to explain it by coincidence plus motivated reasoning. Besant and Leadbeater were drawing on the scientific culture around them, Lord Kelvin's vortex atom theory, Faraday's line of force, and early speculation about subatomic particles, and maybe unconsciously recombined it into a vision that looked like independent discovery. That's probably right. Probably. But notice what occult chemistry actually did, independent of whether its methods were legitimate. It contributed to a visual culture around atomic structure at the precise moment when physicists were first trying to picture the atom. Theosophical imagery, including Besant and Leadbeater's diagrams, and their companion book, Thought's Forms, influenced the emergence of abstract visual art in the early 20th century, including the work of a guy named Kandinsky. It treated the subatomic world as a place that could be mapped and described at a time when mainstream science was still debating whether atoms were real at all. Annie Besant spent her entire life at the intersection of the empirical and the transcendent, never quite accepting that those were separate areas. As an atheist, she tried to build a politic on pure materialism and found it lacking. As a theosophist, she tried to rebuild the material world from the spiritual and found she couldn't prove it. She was always reaching for something just past the edge of what the instruments of her time could verify. Whether that makes her a fraud, a visionary, or something more complicated, I think that's a question worth sitting with.